Shalom, welcome back. We're continuing on with our study of answering the skeptics, those that have objections to the testimony of Keifa given in the writings of Clement and in the historical accounts we have of the Nazarenes. And so today we're going to look at objection number 2, which is, why did Moses write that we can eat meat in Genesis chapter 9? And this is actually related to what we're going to be discussing in video number 3, which is, why did Moses write that we can eat meat in the dietary laws of Leviticus? And so a lot of what's said in this video is going to apply to the next one and vice versa. So I would suggest watching both videos. But for today, we're going to jump into this Genesis 9. So in Genesis chapter 9, Noah's coming off the ark with his family, and Elohim blesses Noah and his sons and says to them, "Bear fruit and increase and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you is on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the heavens, on all that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they have been given. Every moving creature that lives is food for you. I have given you all as I gave the green plants, but do not eat flesh with its life is blood." So whether we are given permission to eat animals here or not, it really hinges upon the meaning of this every moving creature. And so if we look at the Hebrew, this word for moving thing or moving creature is Strong's number 7431, which is the Hebrew word remez. Now, remez is actually used earlier in Genesis. It's used in chapter 1, but there is translated as creeping thing. So if we turn to Genesis chapter 1, it's in verse 24 and 25. It says, And Elohim said, Let the earth bring forth a living creature according to its kind, livestock and creeping creatures and beasts of the earth according to its kind. And it came to be so. And Elohim made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, livestock according to its kind, and all that creep on the earth according to its kind. And Elohim saw that it was good. So notice that there are 3 types of living creatures that are described. One is livestock, which is generally what people think of as edible food or edible animals. Not myself, but that's what most people generally think. Beasts of the earth, which would probably what you would think of as the unclean animals, like lions and tigers and bears and swine and stuff like that. Myself, I would look at livestock versus beasts of the earth, and I would think domesticated animals versus non-domesticated animals. But then there's this third category of creeping creatures. Now, what do you think of as creeping creatures? Well, that would be your creepy crawlies. It would be things like lizards and snakes and bugs and that sort of thing. But it certainly wouldn't mean what we think of as livestock, because notice it says livestock and creeping creatures. So they're not inclusive. They're 2 totally separate categories of animals. And Noah is told he can eat the creeping things, but not livestock. And in fact, if we look at this word and look at how it's translated all throughout the scriptures, it's only translated as moving thing one time, and that's in Genesis 9:3. Every other time, it is translated as creeping thing, creeping things, creeps, or swarms. And when you think of something swarming, you don't generally think of cows or sheep or oxen or something like that swarming. You think of insects swarming. So now if we go back to Genesis 9, let's think about what's going on here. Noah and his sons, they're coming off the ark. So why would Yahuwah tell them that they could eat the creeping creatures? Well, if I'm correct, and it is talking about the cold-blooded animals, like reptiles and insects and that sort of thing, well, it reminds me of a class that I sat through one time. He said, I used to be in the military many years ago, and I was in the Marines, and we were given a class on survival techniques. And one thing that stuck out in this class, and I think the reason I remember it is because I remember sitting there and trying to think whether I would be able to do this or not if I had to. But one survival technique for soldiers that are trapped behind enemy lines in extreme circumstances is to eat insects, ants, and things like that, because you can actually sustain yourself on a diet of insects. And the instructor of the course, he told us a story about a Marine that he knew who had been injured while hiking. And so he was in the wilderness, and he was off the trail, and he was more or less just laying in a ditch hoping somebody would find him. And he was there for several weeks, and he was able to sustain himself because he found a water source, and he also was eating ants. And so he survived for several weeks eating ants when he was in this extreme circumstance. And so if Noah's coming off the ark with his sons, I think that would be an extreme circumstance where maybe it would be necessary to give Noah permission to eat these creeping creatures in order to survive. And actually, if we look at the Septuagint translation of this verse, in the Septuagint, they actually translate it as reptile. For those of you who don't know what the Septuagint is, it is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. It was made in the 3rd century BC by 70 Hebrew scholars that were hired by the king of Egypt to come in and make this translation. So this actually confirms what I'm saying, is that these creeping creatures were speaking about reptiles and the cold-blooded animals. In fact, if you look at verse 4 of Genesis 9, it says, do not eat the flesh, for this life is blood. It seems that the blood is a matter of importance to define what these creeping creatures are. And lizards and insects and these type of animals, the thing that's similar about their blood is that they're all cold-blooded animals. They're not warm-blooded animals. So perhaps Elohim is drawing a distinction and giving Noah permission to eat these cold-blooded animals in an extreme circumstance. But whether we believe that this is, the creeping things, or whether you may still hold to this belief that Noah was given permission to eat all animals, if we look at the rest of Genesis chapter 9, notice that in 9:1 is being addressed specifically to Noah and his sons, and he is saying to them, to Noah and his sons, that he was giving them permission to eat the creeping creatures. But starting at verse 8, he's speaking to a different audience. Elohim spoke to Noah and his sons and those with him, saying, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed. And then he goes through and gives them this covenant that he's not going to destroy the earth again. But he draws a distinction between what he's saying specifically to Noah and his sons versus what he's saying to Noah, his sons, and all of mankind. So you can't really say that he gave all of mankind for the rest of history permission to eat creeping creatures when Yahuwah himself specifically says that that was only for Noah and his sons versus this covenant, which is for everyone. But that brings up another interesting question that I think is applicable to this situation. Verse 11 says, I shall establish my covenant with you, and never again is all flesh cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again is there a flood to destroy the earth. And it kind of raises the subject of why did Yahuwah destroy the earth to begin with? And we're not told a whole lot by Moses, except that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Those were mighty men of old, the men of name. And so if we look at, what's going on with these Nephilim? Verse 12 tells us that Elohim looked on the earth and saw that it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And Elohim said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, because the earth is filled with violence through them, through the flesh that had corrupted itself. And see, I'm going to destroy them from the earth. And so that's why he destroyed all these living creatures off the earth. And if we look into the homilies of Clement, we get a little bit more of an understanding. And this actually lines up with what Enoch tells us also. But Keifa tells us in Homilies 8, starting at chapter 15, they, the Nephilim, on account of their bastard nature, not being pleased with purity of food, longed only after the taste of blood. Wherefore they first tasted flesh. And the men who were with them there for the first time were eager to do the like. Thus, although we are born neither good nor bad, we become one or the other, and having formed habits, we are with difficulty drawn from them. But when irrational animals fell short, or in other words, when these animals fell in short supply, these bastard men tasted also human flesh, for it was not a long step to the consumption of flesh like their own, having first tasted it in other forms. So what Keifa's telling you here is that the tradition or the practice of eating meat came from the Nephilim. So this appears to be the violence that had filled the earth, that the men began to eat the animals. They ran out of animals, and then they began to eat each other. And it reminds me of the story of the destruction of Jerusalem, where people were brought to a point of starvation in the city so that they were even eating each other. Josephus gives us a story about one woman who had was eating her own infant. And according to Keifa, it's not that long of a step. Once you get the taste for meat, it can be very difficult to break that desire. And you can contrast this with what Keifa says elsewhere in the homilies. The things which are well-pleasing to Elohim are these: to pray to him, to ask from him, recognizing that he is the giver of all things and gives without discriminating law, to abstain from the tables of devils, not to taste dead flesh, not to touch blood, to be washed from all pollution, and the rest in one word, as the Elohim-fearing Jews have heard, do you also hear, and be of one mind in many bodies. Let each man be minded to do to his neighbor those things that he wishes for himself. So notice that it's a pleasing thing for Yahuwah for us not to eat dead flesh. And I'll remind you again of what Keifa says in the Nazarene Acts. It's really up to you, the listener, to take responsibility for your own salvation, your own doctrine, not to just watch what I say and then decide to agree with it or disagree with it, but you have a duty to study these texts for yourselves. And you may say, well, I don't have to study what Keifa says. You know, it's not the writings of Clement. They're not in the Bible. Well, I would remind you that Keifa is the person who Yeshua says in Matthew 16 was given the keys to the kingdom. And whatever he were to bind on earth is bound in the heavens. So if Keifa tells you not to eat meat, if the man with the keys to the kingdom of heaven tells you not to eat meat, according to Yeshua, it is bound on earth as it is in heaven. So you may argue that well, you know, just because Keifa says it doesn't mean that Yeshua said it, doesn't mean that it's true. But Keifa tells you in the Nazarene Acts and in the homilies that all he can do is repeat to you what Yeshua has told him. And Yeshua himself tells us that Peter's the one with the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So I pray that this has been a blessing to you. I invite you to watch part 3, where we'll talk about the dietary laws in Leviticus. And I bid you shalom. Goodbye.